Hi, this is William Henderson,
And this is B. McGraw.
and this is the second part of our episode on higher education. This is the Unjerked podcast. We're affiliated with B. McGraw's website.
The Journal of Astrological Big Data Ecology, or JABD.com.
So instead of making fake journal articles on our podcast, we look at real academic journal articles and use them to dispel some myths about certain topics. So let's get going. So with all that said, the third thing was, the third theory about college was that it improves the human capital of people who graduate from college in terms of being more informed citizens, better critical thinkers, just having more knowledge in general. And at the median level, that seems to be true. So there's this paper. It says, "Does college teach critical thinking? A meta-analysis by Huber and Kunsel." And they are from the University of Minnesota. And they looked at, essentially, they do a meta-analysis. It says the results suggest that both critical thinking skills and dispositions improve substantially over normal college experience. So they kind of look at the literature, and essentially their result is that there is actually a change in actual ability to do critical thinking over college, over the college experience. So that seems to be the case.
And this is compared with people that don't and how they're critical thinking.
I think this is like talking about the same people from the beginning to the end of college. So how much
would make sense that people would have better critical thinking skills, because on average you're going from 18-year-olds to 22-year-olds, and that's, I think, when most people get most of their critical thinking skills naturally, just from becoming adults. So
right.
I hope they compare it to people who are in the same age range and not coming to college.
And then next we look at investigating student learning gains in college, a longitudinal study by Ruhr and Liu. And this basically says they look at college students' performance in critical thinking, reading, writing, and math skills as assessed by the ETS proficiency profile. Full disclosure, these people seem to work at the Educational Testing Service. That said, their research is that after being in college for 1 or 2 years, there were no demonstrative significant learning gains, but after 3 or more years, there were small to moderate gains.
Can't we find a study written and conducted by people completely unaffiliated with the university that have no college degrees? Just a bunch of bros hanging out.
I wonder if there's ever been a paper published by just a bunch of dudes.
Completely unaffiliated with a college.
And so there's...
Well, maybe that adds to the power of some of this being inconclusive, is that it's inconclusive, and you would think that people spending all of their time and energy getting a degree would want it to be worthwhile.
Finally, we're going to look at a meta-analysis. It says meta-analysis on average undergraduate students' intelligence is merely average by Udall, Violo, and Gibson. And these are from a couple Canadian universities: Mount Royal University, University of British Columbia, Okanagan campus. I probably mispronounced that. And then Western University. And basically their research is saying, what are the IQ of college students over time? And so their research basically says the average IQ of undergraduate students today is merely a 102 IQ points and declined by 0.2 IQ points per year. And essentially the research, it looks like, let me go back a sec. So the article that quotes this research says that undergraduate IQs have fallen from roughly 119 in 1939 to 102 today, just above the population average of 100. I know IQ is not the perfect measurement, but I think the overall point I'm trying to make here is in the 1939, college students were considered, I mean, not considered, they were measured to have higher IQs by almost 20 points than the average population. And the standard deviation for IQ is usually, it's either 15 or 16 points.
Hmm.
So they used to have a little bit more than one standard deviation higher IQ, which I suppose would put you in the 68th percentile, something like that.
Yeah.
And now it's 102, which is basically, the average IQ is 100. So basically now college students have the same IQ as the average population. My theory about this is that, a lot of the expansion in college attendance, I guess what I'm trying to say is, when college was a thing that fewer people went to, I'm sure some of it was class-based where wealthier people were more likely to go to college, but part of it was also people who did better in high school and were more book smart were more likely to go to college. And it seems like a lot of the expansion in college attendance is people who were maybe a little lower on the high school performance ladder. And so, it's another data point to look at. But again, the question which is unresolved is, okay, like if everyone goes to college, not everyone, but if more people go to college, at what point is it no longer a valid signaling tool? When the average college student has the same intelligence as the average person, I
think the danger of the signaling tool now is if you don't go to college and graduate from college, what is wrong with you? So it's almost like a negative signaling if you don't do it, which I think is the big danger.
That is the danger. But I mean, that's clearly, at a certain point, that clearly becomes, like I said before, you can't have everyone go to college because, let's say magically we had a magic wand and everyone went to college. You'd still need people to work retail jobs. So ultimately you'll have people who went to college who can't get any more work, and then they'll be told hey, the only job you can get is a retail job. In fact, that's already happening right now. There's people I know who end up, going into retail jobs after college. Maybe not forever, but that's the thing that happens. So you eventually reach a saturation point where it's well, we still need people to do retail jobs. We still need people to work in the trades. And so you'll end up having college graduates who go into those fields. I mean, that's just,
it's going to happen if enough people go to college. Yeah.
So I think the overall point is college does on average seem to make people better thinkers, make them better at math, make them better at reading, writing, etc. That seems to be a trend that still holds up.
That would be weird if it was any other way.
Yeah. So anyways, one last thing I want to talk about before we move on to student loans and tuition is when it comes to selectivity of college. And this is a big discussion when it comes to, the affirmative action debate, the college admission scandal, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of those stories are about an elite tier of colleges that most people don't go to.
Most of the time, only the elite.
Yeah, there's this Pew Research article that says the majority of U.S. colleges admit most students who apply. So they created, they looked at the data in deciles, and for people who, for colleges who accept between 60 and 70 or 70 and 80% of their applicants, what percent of colleges is that? And I ran the numbers to say, okay, when we look at 50% and above, so colleges who accept at least half of applicants, that's 80% of colleges in the U.S. So most U.S. colleges are not competitive to get into. Most colleges, 80% of colleges admit most people who apply. So that's another thing to keep in mind, when you hear these debates on in the news about these things, is most colleges they're just non-selective. It just is what it is. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. That's an interesting thing is okay, if your acceptance rate, if you're such a good school and you have a 4% acceptance rate, well, why don't you just quadruple admission? because, you have such a great product, this school that you have, has such a great educational system. Well, why don't you just quadruple enrollment? But I think a lot of times the low acceptance rate is a feature, not a bug.
I believe that is the case. I read that one book, Weapons of Math Destruction, and I believe lower acceptance rates are part of how you do college ranking.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, of course, if you start ranking the lower acceptance rate colleges, then you are going to start limiting supply, so that you're going to have lower acceptance rate, and that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, because then more people try and get in, and yeah.
Right. So now we're going to talk about
thing, apparently.
Yeah. Now we're going to talk about tuition and student loans. I would argue this is the biggest debate about higher education right now in our country. And what I don't like about the debate is a lot of people who are passionate about this issue are angry at loan providers,
That's
at
never
lenders.
made that much sense to me in the first place either.
Well, first of all, most student loans are owned by the federal government. So I was reading these comments, on Reddit, and they're just like, oh, the banks who like own these loans are this. And I'm like, most of the loans aren't owned by banks. Most of the loans are owned by the federal government. Like, so that's point number one. But point number two, like, it's kind of missing the point. The point is, like, why did you take out such a big loan in the first place? The reason is tuition is really high. That's the problem, is that tuition is high, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, and books are a whole different issue. I think a lot of textbooks are a total scam when it comes to, charging $250.
Oh, they're
for like
wildly expensive for what you get out of them.
In a new edition that has like, 2 lines are different in the book, and they like print a new version. I think that's a whole separate thing. But the problem is colleges are charging more, and they've been charging more and more, outpacing the rate of inflation for decades now. So that's the crux of the problem. And so the question is, like, why is that happening? And there's a couple sort of explanations behind it. So the one that I think is silly, and I read this on a CNN article, and I thought it was complete crap. They're basically saying, well, college is a very high touch experience. You need instructors, and you need professors, and you need this and that, and like, it doesn't scale. You can't scale it up, because if you add more students, you have to add more professors, and that costs money. But that's not a valid argument, because we're looking at per capita numbers, like per student. Even if it's like, okay, you add more professors when you bring in more students, well, those two should cancel out, right? So you should still, like, on a per capita basis, the cost should not be going up that much. So I thought that was a silly argument. The other argument is that state funding is going down. So states are spending less money. I see
that one a lot.
And that is, frankly, not really a legitimate argument if you actually look at the data. There's this one like econ professor who he was writing on his Substack or something. He was writing about like, oh, well, that's the reason why. And he was like, made a chart saying like percent of, tuition increase that can be attributed to reduced state spending. And a lot of the numbers were like above 100%. It said like 115% for like this state. And I'm like, that's literally impossible. You can't explain more than 100% of a phenomenon. That was really disappointing. Like he was like a legit professor, and
oh gosh.
But basically, so there's this National Education Association report, and it says across the U.S., 32 states spent less on public colleges and universities in 2020 than in 2008, with an average decline of nearly $1,500 per student. As a result, students need to pay and borrow more. So the interesting thing, and part of it is, I think the analysis is a little difficult because populations have also increased. But I think the point is 32 states, that means 28 states are, between 2008 and 2020 increased their spending, right?
Well, that or kept it the same.
Yeah, I mean, kept it the same, and also, also, how much did the population change? Complicates things. But when you look at that, I mean, half of colleges did, or half of states did not decrease their total funding. And then it says the average decline is $1,500 per student. That's not a lot of money in the grand scheme of things when you look at how much people are borrowing to pay for college. You're talking about four figures. So when you actually look at the numbers, it doesn't seem to really explain why tuition is going up. And there's this article from Pew Trust that looks at higher education spending. And let's see, I'm trying to see what.
Yeah, and that also makes that's also like the whole healthcare debate, and I kind of like I don't like the reasoning. It's like, why is it so expensive? It's so expensive because it's not free. The state's not paying for it. I'm like, well, that doesn't make the cost go away. Whoever's paying for it.
Yeah, and another thing you see is, so you look at federal and state higher education spending. So state funding, went down from 2008 to 2012, and it's been increasing a bit since then. Federal Pell Grants, research funding, there's various levels of funding. It seems like federal spending and state spending have converged recently. It used to be much more state funded and less federal funded, and now there seems to be more of a convergence. Obviously, the GI Bill explains a lot of the federal funding because the GI Bill is a federal benefit. And so, there are those are a few other points to look at. And then finally, the Brookings Institute looks at, essentially what are the causes? Is it the disinvestment? Is it the easy credit? And basically their research, and this is pretty interesting. So basically they said, they quote a paper where it says, the authors concluded colleges increased tuition between 15 and 60 cents for every $1 increase in borrowing limits. So that's for the student loan side of things, right? So the higher the borrowing is, the more they increase tuition. But then they also look at, and they also quote, well, I don't want to talk smack about the particular professor, but they are quoting the thing I just mentioned, where it says they're quoting the professor that said share of tuition hike explained by cuts, and a lot of the numbers are above 100%.
Oh gosh.
Yeah. But they also look at, there's another paper they quote from the Department of Education. It says, changes in appropriations, so this is state funding, account for between 19 and 28% of change in published in-state tuition price. So it explains part of it, but only like a quarter of the change. And then there's another paper that has an even lower number. It says, the authors find that, and this is from the National Bureau of Economic Research, it says, for the average institution in our sample, it would take an increase of $1,000 in state appropriations per student to generate an in-state tuition reduction of only $60. So that's 6 cents per dollar in appropriations. So if the state increased funding by $1, it would decrease tuition by 6 cents, is what their results said. Ooh. So the overall point of this research is like, obviously it explains part of the rise in tuition. If you're giving fewer state funds to universities, they have to make up that shortfall somewhere else. But it seems like it only explains a very small percentage of the rise in tuition. So the other big thing, really, I mean, the real answer...
It sounded like the big answer is just because people are able to borrow enough money to do it.
Yeah, I mean, the ultimate... I mean, the real thing is like universities are just spending more money on stuff. But the reason they can get away with it is because of easy credit. So there's this Federal Reserve Bank of New York report on credit supply and the rise in college tuition, evidence from expansion in federal student aid programs. And basically, they say we studied the link between student credit expansion and the rise in college tuition. And it says tuition changes in subsidized loan maximums lead to 60 cents It says we find a pass-through effect on tuition of changes in subsidized loan maximums of about 60 cents on the dollar, and a smaller but positive effect for unsubsidized federal loans. So it seems
Yeah,
pretty
that
clear,
makes sense.
like the reason. I mean, essentially, what this is guaranteed student loans basically destroy the pricing mechanism. So
Well, I think
price.
it's guaranteed student loans, and then also the things we were just talking about before this. If everyone is led to believe that, your future value of a college education is, upwards of $1 million lifetime earnings, then you're probably likely to think, oh, yes, this is a worthwhile trade off to borrow all of this money to pay for this thing that is clearly worth this much, and I'll just pay off the debt later. So it's just a matter of people are willing to do it. So, of course, they're going to charge that much. And you're able to borrow enough money. So,
I mean, you're talking too about you're talking about 18-year-olds. You're talking about people who would smoke cigarettes or drink alcohol because of peer pressure, and who would steal hubcaps because of peer pressure. Maybe not steal hubcaps,
I feel
but
like this is parental peer pressure.
Right, but the thing is, credit is an interesting thing. I think credit can really, really help out. Getting a mortgage can give you access to home ownership. Student loans can give you access to education. Business loans can give you the chance to build a business. So credit can be a very good thing under the right situation. But credit is inherently biased towards wealthier people. It's much easier to get a loan if you're wealthier than if you're poor, just because you're more likely to pay back the loan if you have financial resources. And so the whole theory behind student loans, I mean, when you look at it on paper, you would not, this is not the good profile of a borrower. You're talking about someone who's 18. They, probably don't have a work history at all, or maybe they just worked at McDonald's or something in high school. They have no, there's no collateral. When you get a mortgage or you get an auto loan, there's collateral. And so if you stop paying your loan, the bank can repossess your house or your car. And so when there's collateral, it's lower risk for the lender, and they can, interest rates are probably lower too because of that. But when you're talking about student loans, they can't
repossess a diploma and give it to someone else.
There's no collateral, so there's nothing to repossess. With credit card lending, the interest rates are much, much higher, so that offsets a lot of the risk for the bank, and the total amounts are lower. Credit card debt, it could be just a couple $1,000, but when you're talking about student loans, you're talking about 5 figures. And so, on the surface, it's just a horrible profile of someone to lend money to, someone who's 18. They have no credit history at all. They have no employment. There's no money coming in.
I guess this begs the question then, is the business of student loans profitable?
It is profitable. So the thing about student loans is that it is a federally subsidized program. The vast 90+% of student loans are given by the federal government. And so your student loan servicing company, they don't own your debt. They're just like a middle person that basically, runs a website. That's basically what they are. They don't own your debt. And, they I'm sure they get some sort of cut of the loans that they manage, but the federal government owns most of the student loans. And and that's probably one reason why, because student loans, you can't, if you declare bankruptcy, you still have to pay them off. And I believe if you still have a balance outstanding when you go into retirement, you have your Social Security wages garnished. And so the reason that is, I believe, is it's just one way for the lender, which is the government, to kind of balance the risk of lending money to someone who just is not the type of person a bank would lend money to. It's as simple as that. And the reason why student loans exist is because in the old days, a lot of people couldn't go to college because they couldn't afford it, because college costs a lot less than it does now. But if you have zero credit, than if someone comes from complete poverty, like they can't afford college. Even if they got good grades in high school, it's like, hey, you have to pay this much money in tuition. It's like, well, I don't have the money. And they're like, well, you can't go to college then. So it
Yeah,
was
what are you
well
going to spend your
intentioned.
20s working a fast food joint just so you can go to college in your 30s? Would make no sense.
Yeah. So like it was well intentioned because there was a class of people. Cause like these days, that's less of a problem. I'm sure it exists here and there, but like someone not being able to go to college because they can't afford it, that's not really a problem. The problem now is on the back end is like
Yeah,
I went to
that's
college.
most of the complaints.
Yeah, I went to college.
Yeah.
Now I can't pay back my loans. But like but people saying like I could not attend college because I didn't have the money, that seems to be much less of an issue now. So it was a well-intentioned policy, but the reality is easy credit increases prices. That's just it just is what it is. That's what happened in the housing crisis. That's why house prices went up in the mid 2000s. It's because like everyone with a pulse was getting credit, was getting a mortgage. And that's just what happens when you destroy the pricing signal, the pricing mechanism.
Yeah, so is the only reason why this doesn't even seem like it's appearing to be a bubble is this just because it's held by the federal government?
Well, I think it's I think for most people, the present value of your future earnings increase of going to college is still higher than the cost of student loans. So for most people,
Yeah.
financially, it still makes sense to go to college. There will reach a point though where like tuition will stop going up. It's not going to go up forever. Like people are not going to be paying $1 million a year to go to college. So you will reach a point where people just say like, I'm not going to pay this.
Well, here's one question is why aren't colleges more competitive on their tuition prices?
Well, because I think you mostly have, you're talking about 18-year-olds and their parents, and I really think the allure
They
of
just want the best for their children.
the allure of prestige or facilities or the name, that's what people care about. Like you just don't I don't think people making the college decision are thinking in purely economic terms. I mean, that I think that's what it is.
They should have
So
gone to college. They would know they're making a mistake.
so why, like, the concrete drivers of like where's the money going? So obviously lenders get interest payments, but when it comes to the actual tuition, that obviously goes to the university. What is the university spending it on? And frankly, the U.S. News and World Report talks about it. A big part of it is administrative expenses. So you just have a growth because like the actual like teaching, professors and instructors, they're not seeing a huge growth. You're not seeing a huge growth in headcount. And in fact, sometimes the opposite problem exists where you have adjunct professors who like essentially are never going to make tenure, but they're spending a bunch of money or a bunch of time teaching classes, not making, as much money as you'd expect. And they look at, changes in college spending from 2015 to 2020. And they break it out between instructional spending and institutional support. So instructional is like the professors, anything related to direct teaching. Institutional support is more administrative. In community colleges, institutional support, and this is over a 5-year span, it increased 3.7%. And the sort of institutional, so that's institutional went up by 15.5%. At private universities, research universities, it was 2.5% instructional, 6.7 institutional. At public research universities, it was negative 0.1% instructional. So they spent less
Whoa.
on instructional spending, and then institutional support went up 7%. And the most extreme example, master's degree granting private universities, instructional was negative 5.8%, whereas institutional was
Whoa.
negative 0.4%. So there's a clear like
So they are
the money
spending less on the actual value. Dang.
in some, depends on the particular type of institution, but like they're not driving all this money into professors or into having more instructional resources. That's not where the money's going. The money's going into administrative bloat, and that just is what it is. And there's another white paper that kind of talks about this as well, but it kind of mirrors what we mentioned before, where this other white paper talks about, and this is from the American Council on Trustees and Alumni, and they look at what are the outcomes of these increased tuition, increased spending, and it says spending has a minimal impact on graduation rates. So at public institutions, spending on instruction and admin had statistically significant but inconsequential correlations with graduation rates. Spending on student services had no correlation with graduation rates, etc. So, the actual change in graduation rates is not large. Where the correlation is there, but the actual effect is quite small. And so, I mean, that explains it, and then there's a few other things, like discounting is a thing. So one thing colleges will do is they'll have a really high sticker price, and then they'll give, essentially it's sort of price discrimination, not discrimination like, being like discriminating against people. Price discrimination is a specific term meaning people have different prices they're willing to pay for certain products. And essentially a lot of universities, their way of being like, okay, like we know some students will, come from rich families, they'll pay a lot of money to go to college. Some people come from, less wealthy families, they're willing to pay less for tuition. So we're going to try to like match each of those. Let's say like there's people from various backgrounds that we all want to come to our college. We'll maximize our own profit by like offering different, final tuition prices to those different types of people. So a lot of colleges, they'll have very high sticker prices, but then they'll give significant scholarships to people depending on their needs or, some other factors as well. So that explains part of it. But the research basically says that, it's a thing, but it doesn't explain, it's not a one-to-one correlation where, the discounting is not keeping up with tuition growth. And then there is, facility spending is part of it. It doesn't seem to be a huge driver, but that does seem to be a part of the increase in tuition. But what's happening is that colleges are just spending tons of money on just random stuff. All sorts of administrative, we need to have the office of XYZ. We need to have the office of, ZYX. We need, this group of people who help out with this thing and this group of people who help out with this thing. And you just have like a huge infrastructure of people who are not professors, who are not teaching, but they get these jobs at universities. And I mean, that's really what the explanation is. It's as simple as that, And, I think the interesting thing about the student loan debate is that, like very few people get angry at the colleges, but they're the ones who are ultimately at fault, I would argue.
Yeah, I would definitely make that argument after looking at all this evidence. Because, well, I guess the flip side is you can make an argument to get mad at the people taking the loans, as in they wouldn't have charged this much if you didn't, let all these people borrow it and do it, and it's almost predatory lending. But then, like, the alternative is you don't lend money to people that could really use it. Mm-hmm. So, like, I imagine there's some space to make the argument that some people shouldn't get student loans if it doesn't make sense, or maybe make that part of the process more discriminatory, or at least limit how much you can spend on student loans. As the evidence you were looking at showed, for every dollar maximum in a student loan, there was a 60-cent increase in tuition. Like that seems pretty direct.
Well, we talk about solution. Yeah, I don't think the solution should just be no student loans anymore. Like, get rid of student loans.
Maybe just make it more discriminatory who gets them.
Well, I don't think you should borrow money at all. Like, or maybe if you wanted to, but I think because high school is fully subsidized by state governments. Like, unless you decide to send your kids to private school. we'll talk about solutions later. I really think there should be some sort of just subsidization of college, as long as there's also subsidization of trade schools and other outcomes as well. But
or at least if you were going to do it, you might be a little bit more discriminatory of who uses those subsidies.
Well, see, because I think if states have if the government has much more of a influence, or if much more of the actual funding comes from the government, there's much more of an incentive to control costs. Whereas when you have student loans, the loan is an asset for the government. So the government makes money from a student loan. And because the interest rates are usually probably a little bit higher than like mortgage rates. And so, the government makes money from loans. So they actually profit from people being in debt. And so there's not really an incentive to rein in spending, if that makes sense. So I think there are two different forms of subsidization. One is, subsidizing people by providing this structure of loans, and the other is directly paying for people's education. I think the latter is much more likely to instill cost discipline, because most college students go to public universities. I think the conversation is a little different when should the government subsidize private education? That's a separate conversation. Okay, that's part 2 of our episode on higher education. We'll see you next week to wrap it up with part 3.